the long shadow of Bob Mueller, a public servant with such a sterling reputation, such integrity, such influence, which many people say was earned the old-fashioned way with decades of studious public service. A prosecutor who's so respected that when he walked out to that lectern 1 week ago today and pronounced that he didn't want to speak about his probe again after that, many people initially responded deferentially, like, well, I guess that's it. He doesn't want to speak again, and he's Bob Mueller, isn't he usually right? That was really honestly how a lot of people reacted, including some very important people in Congress. But that understandable reaction is not any kind of legal rule. It's more like a feeling, a little Bob Mueller feeling right here. And you might say, you understand that feeling. This guy works hard. Maybe he knows best. But I want to be clear about the facts that explain some of what I'm about to tell you that's happening in the news tonight. Legally, this is not up to Mueller or Barr or certainly Donald Trump. Congress decides who is subpoenaed. And the signs coming from the few people in Congress who make that decision tonight, the Speaker and a very small number of relevant chairs tonight, they seem to be coming around to the public position that they will make Mueller testify, regardless of his stated reticence. Here is House Judiciary Chairman Jerry Nadler today.
Let's just say that I'm confident he'll come in soon.
Will you need to subpoena him to make that happen?
We may. We will if we have to.
How much longer will you wait to subpoena?
I'm not going to comment. Not too much.
The people with the subpoena power, they don't have to negotiate much in public. But what you just heard there does sure sound like a sign that Democrats are now willing to compel Mueller. They're saying so. And it's not the only area also where we should note they are grinding forward. Nadler also today previewing his obstruction hearings about the president, blasting the Department of Justice for asking to delay the Barr contempt vote, rejecting DOJ's tactics.
We've seen this movie before, where they negotiate in bad faith. They make ridiculous offers. They waste time. We negotiate in good faith. And the night before, and shortly before the hearing or whatever it is, they say, well, we're breaking off negotiations. They suddenly say, well, to continue negotiations, cancel the subpoena from again or call up the hearing. We're not going to do that. We're not fools.
So there is the Mueller testimony on one track, obstruction hearings on another track, and then the question of whether any of these roads would build the pressure or a march towards actual impeachment. Half of the Democrats on Nadler's own Judiciary Committee support that kind of inquiry.
I don't know about inevitable, but it's quite possible.
And if it did happen, how soon would it have to happen? I mean, you wouldn't want to bleed into election year. What would be?
I don't know. That's a judgment call. I don't know.
I'm joined now by Barrett Berger, a former federal prosecutor in the Southern and Eastern Districts of New York, Brittany Cooper, professor at Rutgers University, and former federal prosecutor Joyce Vance. Great to have each of you here. Barrett, when you see this discussion with Mueller, do you understand why so many people felt like, gosh, well, he doesn't want to do it? Don't make him. And yet, do you think that it looks like Democrats might make him?
Right. You understand why people thought that. I mean, here you have him come out the first time we really hear his voice. And one of the few things that he uses these precious minutes to say is basically, please don't make me come back here, guys. Coupled together with the fact that he has this 400-plus page document that includes all of his findings and him saying, this would be my testimony. So you could see why a lot of people would say, well, look, he has this big document. He doesn't want to do it. Let's give the guy a pass. That being said, as I think many people have pointed out, there's a huge difference between hearing a live witness testify about something and reading a report. Hearing Mueller testify, even if honestly it is just him detailing things that are already in that report, would be so much of a better way for people to actually digest what's in the report, would be a much better way to get that information out there. So I think there is still value of him testifying, even if it's just simply reading that report.
So as a prosecutor, I know you respect him. You think, yeah, his feelings here just don't carry the day.
Yeah, I mean, you don't always get what you want in this situation. So he can say he doesn't want to come. I think he ultimately will come if asked. He certainly would come if subpoenaed. So I understand why he doesn't want to. Nobody wants to testify if they don't have to. But I think ultimately, if Congress decides they want to hear from him, he'll certainly make himself available.
Yeah, and Brittany, I don't want to get too high-minded over here. But giving press conferences and writing reports where you control everything is different than being questioned. Lawyers and prosecutors and journalists know that better than some. We tend to ask a lot of questions.
Yeah.
And so part of what Mueller's saying is, I defined it this way, and that's where I want to leave it. And I would say for the Congress, which has a different role, it's very different. And I say that not only for maybe some who are critical of Trump and want to explore things that weren't pursued more aggressively, but also obviously for the Republicans on the committee who want to finally press him on the things they thought were overreach.
Yeah. You know, I think that there's two things here that really matter. One of the things that the Republicans have prevailed in the last 10 years is the political theater of it all. So this was the repealing Obamacare over and over and over again, even every time that it failed. It gave their base the sense that they were doing something, that they were fighting. Democrats have got to get into the political theater of this, and they have got to communicate that they are fighting, that they are turning over every stone. They are making sure that there is deep integrity to this process. The base needs it, because we had a blue wave in November because we wanted to see real change. The other thing is, my friend Dr. Toby Sanders made a really important point about Mueller. He talks about the fact that Mueller has a deep sense of integrity, right? He respects the rule of law. He's conservative. He wants to toe the line. But integrity is not the same thing as courage. Now we need some political courage, and that means that Mueller needs to speak up. What Donald Trump has done is he has helped through a series of terrible practices to erode democratic norms. Mueller is trying to restore the integrity of those norms by following the law to the teeth and not conceding anything and not wanting to violate anything. But at some point, you've got to say, someone has to come in and save the day. He's the man with all the information. Who else is going to do it?
Well, let's dig in on that a little bit, if you would.
Yeah.
How do you distinguish between integrity and courage in this context? Is courage being willing to take actions that are necessary but might cut against your own standing, your reputation?
Yeah. Courage is the willingness to risk something for the thing that you say that you love and you care about. Right now, Mueller is playing it safe. He punted to Barr, a man who he knows has no integrity. He is sort of using restraint as the way to sort of shore up his notion of objectivity. Mueller wants to be seen as a guy who is objective and who is divorced from any political investments. That's not what we need anymore. Now we need folks to say, what about the sake of the Republic? What about the fact that we have very credible evidence that we have a man basically running a criminal enterprise from the White House, and everyone is using the law as a reason to be cowards. We can't have it anymore. And if Mueller would step out of his comfort zone, well within the bounds of the law, and say, I think that these men are making a mockery of our justice system, and so I feel compelled to testify, I think that that's what American courage dictates.
Joyce, Brittany lays it out. I mean, it's one of those things when you hear a really good argument in court and you start feeling really strong. That's got to be right. When she says it like that, it makes me think, yeah, that's got to be right. And he's got to testify, and you got to have an open hearing under oath where people say, I know you say you were not confident he didn't commit a crime, but when he said people who comply with your probe are rats, did he sound like a mob boss? Was that a dereliction of duty? Was he blowing the oath of office?
Right.
So I agree with Brittany's conclusion that Bob Mueller needs to testify, and he will one way or the other, either, as Representative Nadler pointed out tonight, voluntarily or pursuant to a subpoena. As a rule of law kind of guy, Mueller will not, as so many of these folks from the Trump administration have, he will not scorn a subpoena. He will show up and testify if he, in fact, receives one. But I wouldn't be so quick to make assumptions about what Bob Mueller believes. We don't know. And as a prosecutor, he has two North Stars. One is the law, and the other one is the facts. And I suspect that he would be very hesitant to render a personal opinion on any of these issues. We might get him to discuss a little bit more under questioning some of the process he followed. But, you know, prosecutors are very hesitant to put themselves forward, and they often remind each other that they should never inject their personal views into the public arena. We leave that to juries, or in this case, to Congress.
But that's the part I'm going to press you on that's so tricky, because all of that would apply to normal investigations of citizens. But when Mueller comes out as he did, it was only 7 days ago. In the Trump era, you know, time is a flat circle, but it was just 7 days ago. He came out and he said, this isn't for the criminal justice system to resolve. A direct reference to what he explained in more depth, as you know, in the report, that this is for Congress. So then you get to say, well, if it's for Congress and the people who were accused of obstructing the probe, some of them indicted, some of them convicted, some of them, like Mr. Stone, still presumed innocent, those people are over here doing that. And the president has been outlined, what Mueller said was, quote, substantial evidence of obstruction in the report. And now you need to walk Congress through it. At a certain point, that's where that process goes, which is different than a traditional prosecutor. And so I want your views on that, Joyce, as well as your assessment of what Chairman Nadler says about Mueller's duty also today. Take a look.
He has said, he's willing to come and testify, make an opening statement, and then testify only behind closed doors. We're not willing to do that. We want him to testify openly. I think the American people need that. I think, frankly, it's his duty to the American people, and we'll make that happen.
Joyce?
You know, the problem is that none of this is normal. It's unprecedented. And so for a Bob Mueller who's used to operating under a certain set of rules, the real problem is he feels the pull of those rules. But like the rest of us, he has to wonder if they still work and whether we'll see him compromise and perhaps lead Congress through parts of the report. But I have to tell you, Ari, I very much doubt that we'll see him go out on a ledge that direction.
Barrett?
No, I absolutely agree with Joyce on that. I think, the other thing to not lose sight of is Mueller is sort of the big fish here, right? He's the one that they're focusing all their attention on. But there very well may be value in going after other witnesses who may actually be more willing to give more information, right? So we know if Mueller is subpoenaed or if he's asked, he will show up, he will testify. However, they possibly can get the same information, if not more, from other witnesses, whether it's if they're able to get Don McGahn back in there, whether they're able to get Corey Lewandowski, whether they're able to get other witnesses who are part of this obstruction piece of the Mueller report in there. They could possibly provide the same, if not more, information that Mueller ultimately would.
The thing is that the Trump administration is floating their credibility on what Mueller does or does not say. And he knows that. So if Mueller says we didn't charge him because it wasn't in our purview, they could interpret that to the American people as no collusion, no obstruction. This man has to come before the American public, Mueller. He needs to help shape this narrative. This is why I'm saying that he's got to stop being constrained by the rules. As Joyce pointed out, the rules have changed. The Trump administration keeps changing the rules. They're not playing by any set of rules that any of us know. Well, and we keep assuming that the rules are going to save the day.
And to your point, and we've shown this in our reporting, there were other prosecutors operating in similar situations, White House investigations, who did speak much more directly. I mean, Ken Starr thought it was in his purview to go to Congress, testify publicly, send his spokesman on Nightline, by the way, and then say at every turn when the president had a choice, he lied. Now, by the way, as we all know, I think viewers know because we've been talking about it, lying in public is not a crime. This president, the Washington Post has said, has made false, misleading, or lying statements over 10,000 times more than any president. Yes. So Ken Starr was saying something broader than criminal analysis. He was saying, your president's a liar, America, you should know that.
Absolutely. And look, I'm tired of everyone saying, you elected us to power, then we chose someone to run this investigation, but none of us have any power to do anything about this man. This is when you begin to see the erosion of a republic, when we are so constrained by our performance of norms and standards that we cannot, in fact, use that as a guiding star to actually get to the truth. What is the point of rules and standards if they don't actually help us to do the work of justice? And
wasn't it Thomas Jefferson who said no one man should have all that power?
Absolutely. He definitely shouldn't.
It's actually a Kanye quote.
Look,
I don't even know if I'm allowed to quote Kanye.
He shouldn't even have the power that he has, let alone Jefferson.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.